Now that we have the ability to list departments and create employees, it might be time to think about user authentication and restricting some of this functionality to users who have an account and are in a specific role. For example, I might want to restrict functionality in the create employee part of the application to just users who are administrators. Fortunately, there's two things that make this easier. First, the internet template that we selected to build this application includes a register page, includes a login page. That allows a user to enter their username and password and get logged into the site. The other thing that makes this a little bit easier is the authorize attribute in ASP.NET MVC. With authorize, I can apply it to a specific controller action, or I can apply it at the controller level itself. And what authorize will do without any other parameters is say the user has to be logged in. User has to be registered and logged into the site in order to be able to get into this action. And I can even restrict this to specific users or specific roles, a comma-separated list of roles and users. And let's just say that we want to restrict this to people who are administrators. I can apply this at a specific controller action, or I can apply this at the controller level, which will make more sense for the employee controller because I want to protect everything inside of here. And what the MVC runtime will do is intercept every request that is arriving for any action in this controller, make sure the user is in this role, and if they are not, it will not allow them to proceed. It will redirect them to the login page and force them to log in before they can get here. And now the question is, how do I create this role, and how do I put users into that role? Well, ultimately, what I'm going to need to do is add some additional views and functionality to this application, perhaps to the account controller that already does some user management. Add some additional functionality that will allow me to manage registered users, put them into roles, remove them from roles. I know that if you look around in NuGet, you'll see a few packages you can download that will give you this functionality. Troy Good wrote one that I know of, but I'm going to do something very simple that will just bootstrap us and allow us to get started. What I'm going to do is go over to the Entity Framework Code First configuration for migrations, this file that we added earlier when we enabled migrations in this project. And I'm just going to seed the database with an admin role and a user that is in that role. Remember, this seed method runs every time that we execute update database. And so if there's ever data that I need to get in the database that is just boilerplate data, I can add it here in the seed method. But what code do I write? Do I write code using the Entity Framework, or do I write code using ASP.NET? Because it turns out ASP.NET already includes an API for managing users and roles. It's a provider-based model, provider components, so you can have users and roles stored in SQL Server or anywhere you want if you plug in the right provider. All you need to do is implement their API. The default membership and roles providers work with SQL Server, and they are configured in the web.config file that we're using for this project. And they are configured to use the same default connection string that we are using to talk to the eManager database with the Entity Framework. So this is a bit of an interesting situation in the sense that we'll have two cooks in the database kitchen. One is the Entity Framework, which will manage the schema and data for employees and departments. The other one's going to be the ASP.NET membership and roles providers, which will manage the users and roles, not only the users and role data, but also the users and role schema. Here's where you can see the default membership provider configured, the specific provider that is being plugged into the runtime, and also over in this piece of configuration, you'll see what connection string to use, the default connection. There's also a default role provider. I just need to make sure that it is enabled, so make sure that enabled equals true for the role provider in order for it to work. And now what I can do inside of my seed method is use the ASP.NET Membership and Roles API to seed the database. So I could say if roles, and roles, by the way, is in the system.web.security namespace, if roles.role exists admin, so if this doesn't exist, negate this. If it doesn't exist, we'll create it. Roles.create role admin. And now I can do the same thing with a user that I want in this database by default. If membership dot and let's try to get the user first to see if he exists, to see if I exist. You can search for users several different ways. I'll go by username. So if there's a user S. Allen, well, if that returns null, then I know S. Allen doesn't exist, so I'll need to create him. So membership, create user. The simplest possible way to do this is just pass in a username and password. So S. Allen, and I'll use the password fluffybunny @1. And of course, this is just a bootstrapping password. As soon as I get logged into the system, I'll want to change it so that my real password just isn't hanging around in plain text in the source code. And then the other thing I need to do is add S. Allen to the admin role. So before I do that, before I seed the database, let me build this and just show you that we have an authorize roles equals admin attribute on the controller, on the employee's controller. So if I come in and try to create an employee, what should happen is the MVC runtime will detect that I am not authorized to do this. It redirects me to the login page. I'm not able to log in yet until I actually add that user to the database. So let's do that. That is as easy as doing an update database. But before I do that, I'll just show you that currently our emanager.web database only has departments and employees. I'll do an update database that will run the seed method. The ASP.NET membership and roles provider, when I interact with that API, it'll look in that same database, see that the schema doesn't exist to hold users, and hopefully create it for me. So if I come back out and refresh this, I now have applications and memberships and users. If I look at the list of available users, there's S. Allen. S. Allen's password will be stored in the memberships table. That password here will be encrypted with a salt. And I can also make sure that we have an admin role. So this all looks good. It looks like update database and our seed method executed just like I wanted it to. So let's try this again. Create an employee, and now I should be able to log in as S. Allen, fluffy bunny @1. Let's try that again. Fluffy bunny @1, and I'm logged in. I'm logged in as S. Allen. I can create an employee now. I can also go in and change my password. The current password is fluffybunny1. I'll change that to something else to be a little more secure. One thing to be aware of when you have authenticated users making form posts to your application is the possibility of a cross-site request forgery. A cross-site request forgery, CSRF, happens when a malicious user gets one of your website users to submit a form post that they didn't intend to submit, but the browser allows the request to work because it will submit the proper authentication cookie. This forms-based authentication we are using when I log in, it sets a cookie that's around for the duration of the browser session at the very least. And if the user logs into the site, then goes to an irreputable site or opens an email from a malicious person, you can end up with a cross-site request forgery attack. I won't go too much into the details of the attack, because if you want more information, you can look at my Building Applications with MVC3 videos where I discuss one, or see Adam's Pluralsight course on hack-proofing ASP.NET applications. He'll explain it too. I will show you how to reduce the possibility of this attack, and that's by using an anti-forgery token. An anti-forgery token is essentially trying to ensure that when the user submits a form to your site, posts that to your site, that the form they are posting is one that came from your server, and that it's not a form that a bad person put together. It does this by embedding some cryptographic numbers in a hidden form input, and also in a cookie, then making sure that they compare correctly. The idea is that even if the bad guy can submit the cryptographic form input value, they won't be able to set cookies in the user's browser, so this will prevent the attack. The way to help prevent this is very easy. First, what I need to do is add an attribute where I expect this form post to arrive. It's the validate anti-forgery token attribute, and that tells the MVC runtime to look in the hidden input that will be in the form that has the anti-forgery token in it, compare that to the cookie that's arriving in the request, and make sure they match. If they don't, it fails the request. And at this point, if I try to create a new user, the request should fail because I'm asking the MVC runtime to validate the anti-forgery token, but we haven't added one to the form as yet. So if I create a Scott with some arbitrary hire date, then the error message I hope to receive is that the anti-forgery cookie is not present. Hopefully that is what a user will see if a bad person tricked them into making some request. To add the anti-forgery token into the view, it's very simple. It's done using an HTML helper, html.antiforgery token. Just need to save that view. Then I'll come out here and refresh this view so that we get that token embedded as a hidden form input. And let's just view the page source, and I can show you that we now have an input whose name is request verification token. It's hidden, and it has a bunch of strange characters inside of there that represent the token itself. And now when I create a user called Scott112000 and create, that request will go through. Of course, the other thing that I would want to do to make this site secure is run it over an encrypted connection. Because with forms-based authentication, the user's login and password are sent over the network in clear text. If you want more information on using SSL and the encrypted connection, I also include this in my Building Applications with MVC3 course. Finally, it's come time to deploy an early version of this application. Not all of the features that I want here are finished yet, but it's always a good idea to give users the chance to look things over early. And fortunately, deployment to the cloud is only a few clicks away. I am going to deploy to Microsoft Windows Azure websites. If you haven't heard of the websites feature, they're new to Azure and they really make deployment easy and fast. And once you're in Azure, you are in the cloud, which is a very popular place to be these days. And it does mean your site is hosted in someone else's data center, where they are responsible for doing the backups and operating system patches and making sure the electricity is always on. It also means you can scale up very easily by going in and adding more memory or CPU or storage at any time. You can also scale down when you need to. To get started with Azure websites, you'll need an account on the windowsazure.com website. There's a free trial available if you just want to give it a spin. I already have an account, so I'm going to click on Portal. This will allow me to log into the portal, and I'll use a password that is not Fluffy Bunny. But will take me to the portal where I can see all of the services that I have up and running on Windows Azure. All the virtual machines, the websites, the SQL databases, they're all here. What I want to do is create a new website with a database so we can store our employees and their departments. And I'll call this eManager. I want to create a new SQL database for this website, and the region, essentially which data center do I want to select. East United States is fine with me since I do live on the East Coast. On the second page of configuration, I can pick a name for my database. I'll call it eManagerDB. I'll just stick with the web edition, the smallest maximum size, the default collation, and I'll use my existing SQL server that I have set up. If you're doing this for the first time, you'll need to create a new database server and create a login with a password. For me, I'll use the existing server, which means I select it in this drop-down, give it my username, and give it a login password. And once I'm finished with that, I can click the checkbox. Windows Azure will go off and start creating this website, start creating the database for me. This only takes a couple of moments, and then I should be able to see that it's running and click on this URL and actually see the website. The next step would be to get my application published into this website and replace this default content. And that's very easy. I can go to this website by clicking on it. That takes me to the dashboard for this website where I can see the CPU time and requests and the amount of data it's using. From here, I can download a publishing profile, which is what I'm going to do. If you're a fan of Git, you can also set up Git publishing, and that means you can deploy your application just by doing a Git push into Azure. But I'll use the publish profile. This will download a file into my downloads directory. that will give Visual Studio everything it needs to know to publish this website. And with that on my drive, I can right-click on the web project, select Publish. I want to import that publishing profile that I just downloaded. That has all of the configuration information, what service URL to go to, everything that Visual Studio needs. Go to the next page. I want to deploy a release version of this. I want to use the connection string to the database that I have configured in Azure. And this is a neat little checkbox. I'll tell it, please apply my code first migrations when the application starts. That adds a little additional configuration into the web.config that tells the entity framework when it starts up that it's free to run migrations. And that will create the schema I need for departments and employees, and it will run the seed method to populate it with everything I need. And then, before I go to the next step and finally click Publish and finish this, I want to do one more thing, which hopefully is a step that you will not have to take. But at this point in time, Windows Azure doesn't support .NET 4.5. So what I need to do is target .NET 4.0 in my projects. So I will right-click both projects and set the target framework to 4. Again, Azure support for 4.5 is just around the corner, so you probably won't need to go through this step. As for MVC 4, we'll be just fine because ASP.NET MVC 4 can run on .NET Framework 4 or 4.5. I do need to change one other reference though, and that is my NuGet reference to the Entity Framework, because it turns out there's two versions of the Entity Framework version 5. There's the version that works with .NET 4.5, which I'm going to uninstall. And then there's the version that works with .NET 4.0. So just coming back in here and installing this, NuGet will be smart enough to get the correct version of the Entity Framework for this version of .NET, install it into the project, and now I'll just do a build to make sure there's no problems. And there is one small problem here, which is that the compare attribute, I now need to have the system.web.mvc namespace in effect for this. It jumped out of that namespace and into the data annotations namespace when we moved to .NET 4.5, but since we just moved back a version, I needed to add that using. So now everything builds, and now I should be able to come into my website, say that I want to publish this with those settings I just saved previously, and we'll just do a publish operation. At this point, Visual Studio will show me in the output everything that's happening to get this pushed up to Azure. It has to copy over all of my scripts, CSS files, images, and assemblies, so it does take a little bit of time the first time you publish. Now the publish operation has finished, and it has succeeded, so I should be able to come back into this website, do a refresh, and see the website running on Azure. It's at emanager.azurewebsites.net. My code first migrations ran and populated the database with some departments, and I should even be able to log in with my username and password at this point and create some employees for this department, because it did run on a fresh new database that has no employees inside of it. In this module, we finished building out a small MVC4 application and deployed it to the cloud. We got to see how to work with controllers, actions, views, HTML helpers, and the entity framework. If you want more details on building MVC applications, including really deep coverage of things like controllers and Razor syntax, see my Building Applications with MVC3 course. Everything covered there still applies to MVC4. The rest of this course will dive into topics specific to MVC4, like optimizing web pages using the new bundling and minification features, building mobile applications using the mobile features, and building scalable websites using asynchronous controllers.